The National Archives has a page about the Homestead Act, not a conspiracy site or a fringe blog. The United States government's own official archive page. On that page is a sentence most Americans have never read. It says that of 500 million acres dispersed between 1862 and 1904, only 80 million went to homesteaders. I read that line 4 times and then did the math. 420 million acres went somewhere other than American families. Not to the farmers. Lincoln promised a fair chance. It went to speculators, cattlemen, miners, lumbermen, and railroads. 84% of the largest land giveaway in history missed its target, and that is the government's own number on its own website. The Homestead Act of 1862 is one of America's founding myths. Lincoln signs a law on May 20, 1862. Any citizen can claim 160 acres of public land. Work it for 5 years, and it's yours for an $18 filing fee. The first claim was filed at the stroke of midnight on January 1, 1863, by a man named Daniel Freeman in Gage County, Nebraska. He convinced a land office clerk to open up early so he could file before reporting for military duty. The story is beautiful. Former slaves could file claims. Immigrants who declared intention of citizenship could file claims. Women heading households could file claims. For the first time in history, ordinary people could own land simply by working it. More than 25,000 black Americans migrated to Kansas alone during the 1870s and 1880s as part of the Exodus movement, seeking the promise of the Homestead Act. Today, approximately 93 million Americans are direct descendants of homesteaders. That means roughly 1 in 4 people alive in this country trace their family's land, their family's wealth, their family's starting point back to this single law. So when the government's own records show that 84% of the land went somewhere else entirely, you have to ask what actually happened. And when you start pulling at that thread, what unravels is something far more systematic than simple fraud. The act was written to fail. That's not my interpretation. The National Archives describes it as framed so ambiguously that it seemed to invite fraud. The law required homesteaders to build a 12 by 14 dwelling on their claim, but the drafters never specified feet or inches. Speculators built miniature structures, 12 inches by 14 inches, little wooden boxes set on a patch of dirt, then filed claims on 160 acres. The General Land Office, the agency responsible for preventing fraud, was deliberately underfunded. It couldn't hire enough investigators to cover its scattered local offices across the entire western frontier. The investigators it did employ were, in the archive's own words, often susceptible to bribery. And there was a second loophole. The law allowed anyone to skip the 5-year residency requirement by paying $1.25 per acre after just 6 months. This was called commuting a homestead. Speculators used it constantly. They'd file a claim, wait 6 months, pay $200 for 160 acres, and flip it. Historian Paul Wallace Gates spent decades documenting this pattern. Instead of creating a nation of independent farmers, the Homestead Act unleashed what he called a fierce competition for land to resell, in which influential speculators came out on top. But the fraud is just the surface. What matters is where the other 420 million acres actually went. 6 weeks after signing the Homestead Act on May 20, 1862, Lincoln signed the Pacific Railroad Act on July 1. One day after that, July 2nd, he signed the Morrill Land Grant Act, 3 laws in 6 weeks. Together, they redistributed more territory than most wars. The railroads alone received more than 175 million acres of public land between 1850 and 1871. That's an area larger than the state of Texas. The Northern Pacific got 40 million acres. The Union Pacific got 19 million. The Southern Pacific got 18 million. These weren't loans, these were gifts. The railroads then turned around and sold this land to the very settlers who were supposed to get it free. They opened immigration offices in Europe, recruited families to come to America, and sold them land the government had given away for nothing. The Library of Congress documents how railroad companies produced maps distorted to make their land look more attractive than it was. And here's what stays with me. Even today, in many western states, the largest private landowners are still the corporate descendants of those railroad companies. The land never came back. The Morrill Act did the same thing for universities. It granted each state 30,000 acres per congressional representative to fund colleges. Over 10.7 million of those acres were expropriated directly from the lands of more than 250 indigenous nations. Cornell University alone received nearly 1 million acres taken from 230 different tribal nations across 15 states. A Pulitzer Center investigation found that over 500,000 acres distributed through the Morrill Act are still owned by states for their universities today. In fiscal year 2019, those retained lands generated at least $8.6 million in income. For more than a quarter of the parcels, not a single dollar was ever paid to the people who lived there first. 3 acts, 1 summer, 1 president. The Homestead Act gave ordinary people the moral cover. The Railroad Act and Morrill Act gave corporations and institutions the land, and none of it could happen unless someone dealt with the people already on it. Now, a reasonable person might say that land fraud happens in every era, that railroads needed incentives to build infrastructure, that universities needed funding. All fair points. If this were just about bureaucratic failure and corporate greed, it would be a familiar story. But the Homestead Act didn't just distribute empty land, it distributed land that had to be emptied first. And the machinery built to empty it is where this story turns from frustrating to something I still have trouble processing. The Dawes Act of 1887, named after Senator Henry Dawes of Massachusetts, signed by President Grover Cleveland on February 8, 1887. On its surface, it was supposed to help Native Americans by giving them individual land ownership. Each head of family received 160 acres, the same number as the Homestead Act. Not a coincidence. Everything left over, every acre not allotted to an individual, was declared surplus and open to white settlers. In 1887, Native Americans held 138 million acres of land. By 1934, when the policy finally ended, they held 48 million. 90 million acres gone, 2/3 of everything. Approximately 90,000 Native Americans, 2/3 of their entire population, were made landless. Senator Henry Teller of Colorado opposed the act in 1881. His words are in the congressional record. He said, "The real aim is to get at the Indian lands and open them up to settlement. The provisions for the apparent benefit of the Indians are but the pretext to get at his lands and occupy them." He said this publicly, before the law passed. And they passed it anyway. The mechanism was elegant and devastating. After allotments were made, the 25-year trust period would expire. The land then became subject to state and local property taxes. Most native allottees had no cash income and no experience with the tax system that had been imposed on them. They couldn't pay. The land went to tax auction. According to researchers who studied this period, white buyers were literally waiting in line for the land to go into forfeiture, and the Dawes Act created something called checkerboarding. Native parcels were split up, sometimes across different counties, with white settler parcels filling the gaps between them. Managing land that had been fractured into a scattered patchwork was nearly impossible. Tribal governance over these fragmented holdings became a logistical nightmare by design. The Act didn't even provide farming equipment or agricultural education to the people it was supposedly converting into farmers. When asked if allottees would receive seed and tools, Dawes himself was uncertain. He said, "Whether Congress will be liberal enough to set him up, I don't know." This wasn't an unintended consequence. This was how the system converted 90 million acres of treaty land into homesteads, railroad grants, and corporate holdings. But you can't just take people's land, not really, not permanently, unless you also break the chain that connects them to it. In 1879, a U.S. cavalry captain named Richard Henry Pratt opened a school in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. His philosophy, stated publicly at a national conference in 1892, was 7 words long: kill the Indian in him and save the man. Children as young as 5 were taken from their families, their hair was cut, their names were replaced. They were forbidden from speaking their own languages. Between 1819 and 1969, the federal government operated or supported 408 boarding schools across 37 states. A 2022 Department of Interior investigation identified burial sites at more than 53 of these schools. The initial report documented over 500 child deaths. The department estimated that the government spent $23.3 billion in inflation-adjusted terms on this system. I have to be honest about something. When I started researching the Homestead Act, I expected to find a story about land fraud and political corruption. I did not expect to find a parallel system designed to remove children from the same communities whose land was being taken. But the timeline doesn't lie. The Dawes Act broke up the reservations in 1887. The boarding school system was expanding through the 1880s and 1890s. The Homestead Act was delivering the seized land to new claimants. The same government, the same decades, the same people on the receiving end. And then there's Oklahoma. The Cherokee had been forced from their eastern homelands on the Trail of Tears. Roughly 4,000 died on that march. The survivors were promised their new territory as long as the grass grows and the water runs. By 1893, the government was done waiting. On September 16, 1893, a rifle shot cracked across the prairie at high noon. Over 100,000 people surged forward to claim pieces of 6 million acres of Cherokee outlet land. 42,000 homesteads were staked in a single afternoon. The heat was so intense that multiple participants collapsed. Tempers flared as men jockeyed for position with wagons and horses. Some who'd snuck in early, called Sooners, had already claimed the best land before the gun even fired. The government had purchased the land from the Cherokee for about $1.40 per acre after eliminating their cattle grazing leases by presidential proclamation. Decades later, the Indian Claims Commission ruled the sale had been conducted under duress and the land was undervalued. They awarded $14.7 million in compensation. But the land never came back. It never does. This wasn't the first run. In 1889, 50,000 people raced for 1.9 million acres. In 1892, 4.3 million acres of Cheyenne and Arapaho territory were opened. Each run operated under the Homestead Act. Each run was the same mechanism. Treaty land declared surplus, repackaged as American opportunity. There's one more piece I keep returning to. The 1890 Census. It was the most detailed census ever conducted up to that point. It tracked immigration, naturalization, property ownership, family composition, military service, even disabilities. It was also the first census to officially declare the American frontier closed. The census superintendent wrote that the unsettled area had been so broken by isolated settlements that there could hardly be said to be a frontier line. That declaration changed how America understood itself, and then it vanished. On January 10, 1921, a fire broke out in the basement of the Commerce Department building in Washington. About 25% of the 1890 census was destroyed outright. Another 50% was damaged by water and smoke. The cause was never determined. Investigators considered a discarded cigarette, faulty wiring, and spontaneous combustion of sawdust in the building's workshops. And here's what most people don't know. The 1890 census was the first for which the government did not require backup copies to be filed with local offices. Previous censuses had this redundancy. The 1890 did not. One copy existed, and it was stored on pine shelves outside the fireproof vault next to a carpenter's shop full of sawdust and wood shavings. Think about that. The 1880 census was inside the vault. The 1900 census was in another building entirely. The 1890 sat unprotected in the most flammable room in the building. The damaged records sat in a warehouse for over a decade. Then on February 20, 1933, Herbert Hoover laid the cornerstone for the National Archives building. One day later, Congress authorized the destruction of the surviving 1890 census records. One day, the building meant to preserve America's records was christened the same week the government destroyed the census that documented the single most transformative decade in American land ownership. 99.99% of the records are gone. 63 million people erased from that year. If you have ever tried to trace your family before 1900, you've hit this wall. 1880, fine. 1900, fine. 1890, the decade of the Dawes allotments, the boarding schools, the Oklahoma land runs, the railroad land grants, is the one decade you cannot see. Maybe I am drawing connections where none exist. Maybe these are separate policies with separate motives enacted by different people across different decades. Maybe the fraud in the Homestead Act was just incompetence. Maybe the railroad grants were just pragmatic. Maybe the Dawes Act was genuinely meant to help. Maybe the boarding schools were misguided idealism. Maybe the census fire was bad luck. Maybe the fact that all of these things happen simultaneously to the same people is a coincidence that requires no further examination. I've considered that possibility carefully, and I keep coming back to the math. 500 million acres distributed, 80 million to homesteaders, 175 million to railroads, 10.7 million to universities, 90 million taken from tribal nations through allotment, 408 boarding schools, 1 destroyed census. Those aren't disconnected facts, they're an accounting ledger. So what does this mean for you? 93 million Americans descend from homesteaders. That inheritance is real. The farms were real. The work was real. The families that built lives on that land were real. But so was the system that made it possible. The law was written with loopholes. The enforcement agencies were underfunded on purpose. The people already on the land were removed through legal instruments, boarding schools, and treaty violations. The records that documented the transfer were destroyed, and 420 million of 500 million acres ended up not with families but with corporations, speculators, and institutions that still hold much of it today. I'm not saying homesteaders were villains. They were participants in a system designed to use them as the moral justification for something much larger. The land under your feet has a story. Every deed traces back to a transfer. Every transfer traces back to a policy. And every policy traces back to someone's decision about who deserved to own the land and who didn't. The question isn't whether this happened. The government's own archives confirm it. The question is why we were taught that the Homestead Act was a gift when the numbers say it was something else entirely, and what else from that era were we taught to remember wrong?